Welcome to Mystery Vault Prime. Today, we explore one of history's greatest mysteries, the lost city of Atlantis.
For more than 2,000 years, one question has fascinated historians. Was Atlantis real or only a legend? To understand Atlantis, we first need to return to the ancient Mediterranean, where its mysterious story began.
Our story eventually leads to ancient Athens, where the philosopher Plato first recorded the famous tale.
Plato described Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, giving the legend its most famous surviving account.
According to Plato, Atlantis was a powerful island civilization located somewhere beyond the Pillars of Heracles. He described fertile land, abundant resources, mountains, waterways, and a society powerful enough to dominate surrounding regions. At its center stood an extraordinary city, built around enormous concentric rings of land and water. Ships entered its vast harbor, while merchants and workers moved through a busy network of canals and waterways. Plato portrayed Atlantis as extraordinarily wealthy, prosperous, and powerful. But the story would soon take a darker turn. But what made Atlantis truly extraordinary was its unusual design. Look here, rings of water and land surrounding the heart of the city. At the center, Plato described an elevated area where the royal complex and important temples were supposedly located. Bridges connected the different rings, turning the unusual layout into a functioning network of roads and waterways. The canals were not simply decorative. In Plato's description, they formed an important part of the city's transportation system. Beyond the waterways stood defensive structures, reflecting the military strength that Plato attributed to Atlantis. Near the center was a royal district, where Plato placed the rulers who controlled this enormous island kingdom. Plato also described grand temples dedicated to the gods, adding a religious dimension to the city's political power. The central religious tradition of the story was connected to Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea. Plato's account gives Atlantis a mythological origin, linking its royal dynasty to Poseidon and a mortal woman. The story describes 10 royal divisions, each ruled by a separate leader, but ultimately connected under a supreme dynasty. Together, these regions formed a powerful kingdom that Plato portrayed as one of the strongest forces of its age. The kingdom was also presented as heavily militarized, with soldiers, ships, horses, and enormous resources at its command. From its harbors, Plato imagined fleets capable of carrying Atlantean power far beyond the island itself. According to Plato's narrative, Atlantis expanded its influence across other islands and territories around the Mediterranean. And eventually, the story turns from exploration and prosperity towards something much more dangerous: conquest. According to Plato, one city stood against this expansion, an ancient version of Athens. Plato portrays the Athenians as disciplined defenders who refused to surrender to the advancing Atlantean power. In the story, Athens eventually defeats the invading force and becomes the symbol of resistance against Atlantis. But the victory does not lead to a peaceful ending. Instead, the entire story suddenly takes a catastrophic turn.
Plato says that violent earthquakes struck, followed by floods and a catastrophic day and night.
Then the sea rose over the land, transforming the legendary kingdom into a story of sudden destruction. In Plato's account, Atlantis was eventually swallowed by the sea and disappeared from the world above. Imagine watching the streets flood, the harbor vanish, and a civilization built over generations disappear within hours. Whether literal or symbolic, this image of a civilization disappearing beneath the sea is what made Atlantis unforgettable. After the catastrophe, Plato's story leaves us with an unsettling silence. The civilization is gone, and the search begins. For centuries, Atlantis remained buried within Plato's writings, waiting for later generations to wonder whether the story contained a hidden truth. As knowledge of the Atlantic expanded, the idea of a lost civilization beyond Europe became even more tempting. In the modern era, explorers and researchers began searching for physical evidence that could connect the legend to a real place. But where could Atlantis have been? The theories are numerous, and many of them point in completely different directions. One of the most intriguing places connected to the Atlantis debate is Thera, the island we now call Santorini. On Thera, archaeologists discovered Akrotiri, a remarkably preserved Bronze Age settlement buried beneath volcanic material. The settlement reveals a sophisticated society with impressive buildings, trade connections, craftsmanship, and advanced urban planning. Then, sometime during the Bronze Age, one of the ancient world's most powerful volcanic eruptions transformed the region. Volcanic material, ash and volcanic material buried Akrotiri, preserving parts of the settlement beneath the disaster.
The eruption also caused major environmental disruption, and tsunami effects may have affected parts of the wider Aegean region.
The disaster also belongs to the same broader Bronze Age world as the powerful Minoan civilization. This has led some researchers and writers to suggest that memories of Bronze Age disasters may have influenced later stories like Atlantis.
But there is a major problem. The Thera eruption happened many centuries before Plato wrote the Atlantis story.
That enormous gap does not make a connection impossible, but it means we cannot simply identify Thera as Atlantis. The wider Aegean world later experienced major changes and disruptions, but their causes were complex rather than one simple catastrophe. Another theory takes Plato's words more literally and searches for Atlantis somewhere beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. The Azores have sometimes been proposed because their volcanic islands rise dramatically from the Atlantic. But underwater geology does not currently reveal a sunken continent matching the enormous Atlantis described by Plato. The Canary Islands have also appeared in Atlantis theories, largely because of their striking volcanic landscapes. Yet dramatic landscapes alone cannot establish a historical connection. Geological evidence must match the story's specific claims. Then there is the famous Bimini Road, another underformation often connected to Atlantis. Despite its appearance, geological research generally interprets the formation as naturally occurring rock rather than a lost Atlantean road.
And this reveals an important lesson. Something that looks ancient and mysterious is not automatically evidence of a lost civilization.
However, real cities have disappeared beneath the sea, proving that submerged civilizations are not impossible. Pavlopetri in Greece is one remarkable example, a real ancient settlement whose remains lie beneath the sea. Unlike Atlantis theories, sites like Pavlopetri provide physical remains that archaeologists can map, date, study, and independently investigate. That difference matters. A fascinating resemblance is speculation. Independently studied archaeological evidence is something very different. After centuries of searching, no location has been universally accepted by archaeologists as the lost city of Atlantis. And perhaps the most important clue has been sitting in front of us all along. Plato's own purpose in telling the story. Plato often used imagined situations to examine politics, morality, human nature, and the consequences of ambition. Atlantis may therefore have been designed as a powerful contrast to the ideal society Plato wanted his audience to consider. In the story, extraordinary power eventually becomes associated with pride, expansion, and moral decline. Seen this way, Atlantis is more than a lost city. It becomes a warning about power without restraint.
Still, the ancient world suffered real disasters, and memories of those events could have inspired stories generations later.
So perhaps Atlantis began with a mixture of philosophy, mythology, historical memory, and real ancient catastrophes. We know Plato wrote the story. We know ancient civilizations really suffered catastrophic events. But we have no confirmed Atlantis. We still don't know if Atlantis came from old traditions, distant memories, or Plato's imagination. And that is what makes Atlantis so fascinating. The evidence never quite becomes proof, but the question never completely disappears. Perhaps somewhere beneath these waters lies a story we have not yet understood. Or perhaps Atlantis was never there at all. Until the evidence tells us otherwise, Atlantis remains one of history's greatest unanswered questions. Subscribe to Mystery Vault Prime for more.